Here at UFOinsight.com is a story by Marcus Louth entitled The Dyatlov Pass Incident. And Marcus begins, "The fact that researchers and historians alike are not quite sure if the deaths of 9 experienced mountain hikers is a UFO case or not only adds more intrigue to an already macabre but darkly appealing incident. The events took place during the opening months of 1959 in the wicked cold winter of the Ural Mountains, one of the northernmost regions of Russia, then the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Researchers and investigators are not exactly sure of the group's final moments or what ultimately caused their deaths. Nor are they sure why such experienced hikers would suddenly run from their tent, some of them barefoot, most of them ill-clothed for the conditions, seemingly choosing to leave their specialist attire inside the tent, which incidentally was discovered cut from the inside. What we know comes from the recovered diary entries. Tacoma Olsen 2 says, "Wicked cold winter." Now that's the understatement of the century. However, these entries in the diaries stop approximately 24 hours before what is believed to have been some terrifying and bizarre event in the sub-zero, dark, and inhospitable conditions of a mountain range, rather ominously known by the locals as Mountain of the Dead. Their bodies will be discovered buried under the snow in 2 separate locations. One group several weeks after disappearing, one group nearly 3 months later. Immediately upon the grim discoveries, the authorities would assert close control over the details which many believe are still under wraps today. Just what scared these young men and women so much they chose to run to their certain death? Why were they discovered apart? Was a UFO involved? Might that resolve the bright lights witnessed on the evening in question, as well as the apparent damage to several of the trees near the crippled tent? On the morning of 27 January 1959, a group of 10 hikers were making last-minute preparations for their trip into the Ural Mountains. The group's leader, 23-year-old radio engineering student from Ural Polytech, now the Ural Federal University, Igor Alexeyevich Dyatlov, would oversee the preparations as the unit planned to set off for Vizhai, the last and most northern inhabited area of northern Russia. The goal of the group, 8 men and 2 women, including Dyatlov, all of whom could boast grade 2 certification in hiking, was to reach the Otorten mountain and then return. The hike would pass all of them for grade 3 certification, essentially making them as qualified and experienced as was possible at the time. Most of the group were also students at the same university, with 38-year-old Alexander Zolotaryov being the exception, although he was a staff member and alumni of the school. The rest of the group would consist of 24-year-old Alexander, 22-year-old Zinaida, 21-year-old Yuri, 21-year-old Georgy, 21-year-old Rustin, and 21-year-old Nikolai. In terms of luck or circumstance, or perhaps even fate, the 10th and final member of the group, 23-year-old Yuri Yudin, although he would set off with the unit, would fall ill shortly after, and within 24 hours, he was forced to turn back. In retrospect, It was an illness that likely saved his life, and surely something the young man would think about repeatedly in the months and years to come. Incidentally, he passed away in 2013 at the age of 75. The hike seems to have gone as planned for the first 2 days. Dyatlov had agreed with their families and the university authorities that upon their return to Visay, a telegram would be sent so they would know of their safe return. They would estimate, all being well and even allowing for slight delays, that this telegram should arrive with them no later than the 12th of February. By the 31st of January, it would appear the 9-strong team had reached a highland area. However, they now faced the prospect of climbing higher in order to reach their destination on the other side of the pass. Instead of carrying their full inventory of supplies, they would make the decision to store some of their food and other provisions in a woodland area just to the side of their route. The following day, it appears things went as planned, and the group went through the pass. It seems that sometime here, however, a strong blizzard moved in, so strong, in fact, that the group soon lost its bearings. They would find themselves severely west of their desired location. Instead of climbing the pass as they intended, they were now heading up Kholat Syakhl. Incidentally, the local Mansi tribe's translation for this ominous mountain is Dead Mountain, and it is steeped in local legends and folklore. It would appear that they soon became aware of their error, but weather was worsening at such a pace, it was unwise to proceed. They would make the decision to make their camp where they stood and wait out the storm until morning. That is the last known fact of the group's journey. Widely accepted basic version. Everything after the evening of the 1st of February is speculation and theory based on the eventual discoveries. The pre-arranged date of 12th February came and went, with no word whatsoever of the group's return. The families would wait 1 more week. Then on the 20th, they would insist against the wishes of the Hikers Collective Institute that a search was arranged. Even then, the search party was made up of students and teachers who volunteered. However, it soon became apparent that such a search would achieve little and take a long time to do that. Several days later, the military Soviet would conduct an official and widespread search of the area. The Air Force also covered huge areas of snowy mountain ranges with helicopters and search and rescue planes. Several more days passed. Then the first of 2 chilling and gut-wrenching discoveries came. On February 26, a battered and shredded tent was discovered. The campsite was a particularly puzzling scene. It would appear that the vast majority of the hikers' belongings, including their clothes and even shoes, were still present. Wherever the hikers were, they appeared to have left barefoot and not fully dressed. Even more alarming, though, was the state of the tent's ruins. More specifically, the tent had the appearance that it was cut from the inside, suggesting that the scene was not the result of some wild and unknown beast trying to gain entrance to the tent. More likely, the hikers were desperate to cut themselves out, so desperate to leave, it would appear, that they left their clothes and shoes, despite blizzard-like conditions. Then there were the footprints. This is actually an image of the footprints they found. And this is what, like 3 weeks after the incident? It's amazing the footprints are still there. Not only did the footprints show both shod feet and barefoot feet, most likely on the same person. But they would suddenly stop, in the middle of the snow, a short distance away. All around them was undisturbed snow, as if they had just vanished into thin air. They appeared to have been headed towards the woodlands, towards the edge of the campsite. Indeed, it was there where 5 of the hikers' bodies were found. The first 2 were those of Yuri Krivonashenko and Yuri Doroshenko. They were discovered under a cedar tree on the very edge of the woodland. Interestingly, the tree looked to have a substantial number of branches broken, damaged, and in some places snapped off, all at a height of over 15 feet. There were also the remains of a fire near to the 2 bodies. As grim as these first 2 finds were, the discoveries of the next 3 bodies of the group's leader, Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustam Slobodin, were equally as perplexing. The position of all 3 of their corpses would suggest they were heading back towards the makeshift camp, near the cedar tree, where they were literally frozen in their positions, as if some bizarre ice ray had raised them. All 5 of the corpses were poorly dressed, some with no shoes on their feet. How long they lasted in such hazardous conditions after fleeing the tent is unknown. Was the fire the remains of the hikers? Were they mentally together enough and physically able to start a fire? And where were the remaining 4? Over 2 months would pass before the second grim find, a discovery which would raise even more questions. This is the scene under the cedar tree, under the pine tree. Over 2 months following the discovery of the first group came the discovery of the remaining 4 hikers. The find occurred on the 4th of May, and they were buried under over 12 feet of snow in a ravine and over 80 yards away from the location of the first 5 hikers' bodies. What was immediately apparent was these last 4 remaining hikers were substantially better dressed than the first 5. In fact, all 4 of them were practically fully dressed. Perhaps even stranger, some of them were dressed in clothes and wearing shoes that had belonged to their fellow hikers who had died near the cedar tree. For example, Zolotaryov was discovered wearing Dubinina's fake fur coat and hat. Perhaps even stranger, Dubinina had wrapped her foot in a piece of someone else's woolen pants. How long after the first group of hikers did these 4 meet their end? Were they moved to the ravine and buried, or did they make their own way there, huddling up in a desperate attempt to get warm? Might they have been present at the cedar tree location when their fellow hikers died? Does this explain why some of them were wearing their clothing and shoes? Is it even possible that the second group were responsible for the deaths of those in the first group? Or had they simply passed away first, leaving the surviving members of the group with a grim but needed opportunity to increase their chances of remaining alive? Well, they didn't have to pass away first either. If they had that paradoxical hypothermia, they might have started disrobing before they died, and the ones who didn't have the paradoxical hypothermia yet, I'm sure, asked them, is it okay if we have these clothes? And I'm sure they said yes. What is perhaps interesting is that when the inquests were opened into the deaths of the first 5 hikers, They were quickly and perhaps suspiciously wrapped up. It was likely, it said, they had died of hypothermia. The inquest into the remaining 4 hikers, however, would not be as simple. The inquests of the last 4 would reveal some bizarre and terrifying injuries. They would find that all 4 had injuries akin to someone who had been hit by a high-speed truck. While between them they all had severe chest fractures and skull damage, there were no other external injuries. Certainly not consistent with the severe internal injuries each of them had. The report would even state that the internal injuries were in line with someone who had been subjected to a high level of pressure. There were, however, some extremely puzzling injuries to some of the second group members. For example, Dubinina was missing her tongue, eyes, and even part of her lips. What's more, these injuries appeared to be the result of surgical precision. Furthermore, fragments of skull, bone, and even facial tissue appeared to have been carved out, again with medical precision. Further still, skin maceration on her hands was also present. Officially, the inquest would state Dubinina's injuries were the result of the putrefaction process due to her lying face down in the ravine. Some researchers, however, were not convinced with this take on the situation. Although authorities had an obvious desire to wrap up the case as quickly and as quietly as possible, members of the family, as well as independent researchers, would continue to pry into the case. And as the years passed by, theories, speculation, and conspiracies would run increasingly rampant. On what is widely agreed to have been the night in question, there were several reports of strange lights in the skies over the mountains, where the group's battered tent was discovered. Had they been present at a UFO event? If so, were their deaths a result of this? And furthermore, was this a purposeful, murderous act or a tragic accident? A case of the hikers being at the wrong place at the wrong time. There are many reports of glowing orbs over the mountain range on the nights in question. These same nights were allegedly witnessed by the settlements below. To some, the deaths of the hikers were not of a supernatural nature, and not to do with any of the long-standing legends. To some, the deaths were the result of a close encounter with a vehicle from another world. And given some of the injuries, in particular those to Dubinina, their deaths may have not been mere accident. Were the broken branches of the cedar tree at the location of the first bodies the results of a nuts and bolts craft? Might that explain why the footsteps suddenly stopped, with all around them being undisturbed snow? Might they have been scooped up and then dropped near the cedar tree? And if this was the case, why was Dubinina discovered with the second group of hikers? And why were 3 of the group found frozen in positions of returning to camp? Might the hikers, if we assume that a UFO was responsible for their deaths, have been returned separately? Or might the glowing orbs and strange activity on the mountain not be the result of alien intelligence? Might it be a top-secret region for military weapons testing?